Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a fun video talking about the worst books I have read according to Goodreads. This is a video where I will be talking about my Goodreads rankings and talking about I read a bunch of books, put my reviews on Goodreads, and then I looked up and said, which ones have I read that are the worst reviewed? And so I figured that out, tabulated it. I went through I have like 700-ish books on Goodreads, somewhere around there. And so I had to comb through them all to find out which ones. And interestingly, part of my reading is I've read a lot of Star Wars and Star Trek books, and that dominated the list to the point that it was almost the entire list was Star Wars or Star Trek books. So what I decided is I'm going to wait, do Star Wars in another video, do Star Trek in another video. In this video, I'm talking about like not tie-in fiction stuff. Actually there is one tie-in fiction book, but this is original novels that not part of that franchise stuff that would be in my top 10 worst. And you might think they're all of a certain genre. They're not. These vary from fantasy to science fiction. I've got a mystery on here, and I've got some YA on here. And there are times where I think Goodreads is really right on this. This is a terrible book. And then there's times where I'm like, man, is Goodreads wrong on this? And so I'm going to be talking about how I felt about the book compared to what Goodreads, the average rating on Goodreads was. And so I am going to be looking over here. I have written what each average rating was here. So starting with, I have my top 10 on here. So starting with my number 10 worst rated book according to Goodreads, and that's going to be, and again, I'm not including Star Wars or Star Trek, but my top number 10 worst rated book according to Goodreads is New Moon by Stephenie Meyer, that has a 3.6 average on Goodreads. Now, this will come in no surprise because there's a bunch of people who just hate the Twilight books. There are a bunch of people who just, this writing style does not work for them. And I'm sure there are people who really felt that this was a step down, and I felt it was a step down from the first book. I thought the first book was really good, and then I read this book and I thought, it's just okay. It's okay. It's a good book, but it's not amazing. And so I can understand it having a lower rating than perhaps the first book did, but it is not, I think, a terrible book. It's not one of the 10 worst books I've ever read. Certainly not. I really enjoyed the book, but I understand there's a lot of haters out there of the Twilight Saga. My number 9 is my only other YA book on this list, and it is Allegiant by Veronica Roth. And I thought, why is this book so low rated on Goodreads? It has a 3.6 on Goodreads. And I thought, why is that? And then I realized the ending of this book had to have angered a lot of people. Because I think the first and second books, I loved the first and second books, and I even loved this book. But I understand that the ending will make people angry. The ending will really make people mad. And so I thought that this book was really good. I think I even gave it like 4 or 5 stars out of 5. Like I gave it a pretty good rating. I loved it, but I can understand why people hated it. So that's my number 9. My number 8 also has a 3.6 average, and that's the book Ill Wind by Kevin J. Anderson and Doug Beeson. This is a kind of a science fiction apocalyptic type book where this company is trying to clean up a oil spill using these new microbes that have been created, but these new microbes instead start infecting the atmosphere and causing all these problems, and so the government has to work to try to fix these problems, and this causes problems with our space travel and stuff, and our satellites start crashing and all this stuff, and it is not Kevin Anderson or Doug Beeson's best book by a long shot. It is not their best book. But, it's not a terrible book. I gave it like a 4 out of 5. Like, it's an enjoyable read. It's fun. It's okay. So, yeah, that's a little disappointing. All right, coming in next in my number 7 spot on my list is a murder mystery by Agatha Christie titled Halloween Party. It has the apostrophe in there, so I feel like I have to emphasize something. So it's Halloween party. This is, I think, one I've read, I think, like 12 or 13 Agatha Christie murder mysteries at this point, and this is either the weakest one or the second weakest one. I also didn't particularly love Three Little Pigs. I thought that was just okay, and I also kind of feel about this one. It's just okay. This it's a murder mystery. It's a Hercule Poirot mystery. If you've watched the new Hercule Poirot movie, I think it's something in Venice. Murder in Venice or whatever it's called. That's loosely based off of this book, and I put loosely heavily in there because it's loosely based off the book. This book was fine. I gave it like 3.5 out of 5, maybe 3 out of 5. I didn't particularly like it, but I didn't hate it. But if this is the weakest of the Agatha Christie books that I've weakest rated one on Goodreads of the ones I've read, that makes sense at least. So this is one where Goodreads is okay about this. This next book does not deserve this lower rating. This next book has a 3.56 rating, and that is Les Johnson's Mission to Metheny. I talked about this recently in my recommending hard science fiction novels. This is a great hard science fiction novel. I loved it. I thought this was brilliant. Basically, we realize there's this kind of derelict ship heading towards Earth from far away, and so we send a crew out to look at this ship, and basically we learn that the moon Metheny, which is a moon of Saturn, is actually a spaceship, not just a moon. And so you can see Metheny on here on this cover, which I love this cover, and so they have to send a crew out to see what's on this derelict spaceship, and it's a delightful book. It's not the best science fiction book I've read, but it's a delightful book, and so it's kind of sad to see it rated so low on Goodreads. So I really liked it. So that's one where Goodreads is wrong. This is one where Goodreads rated this at a 3.53, and that is Night Watch by Tim Akers. This did not have a great rating on Goodreads, and I read this book and I thought it was very bland. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it. So honestly, this one, the rating makes sense. The rating makes sense. Just didn't care for this. This is like a modern day guys, kind of like Men in Black meets Dresden Files almost. This modern day guy gets sucked into this world of magic, and he has to, like in our world, and he has to go and fight dragons and fight evil creatures and stuff, and work for this group that's basically Men in Black, but for fantasy creatures. And didn't love this book, so that's that. I also have in my number 4 is actually a tie between two books that are basically the same series, books 1 and 2 of a duology, and that is Breach of Peace and Rebel's Creed by Daniel Green. Daniel Green's one of the most famous book reviewers on YouTube, especially for the fantasy sci-fi genre. And he wrote these two fantasy novels in 2021, and I read them both right when they came out. Book 1 I read on release day, I believe, and I enjoyed them. I gave them like a 7 out of 10. They were fun. I didn't love them, but I enjoyed them. I thought they were pretty good. And so to see them with such a low rating of 3.53 on Goodreads is just so sad. So yeah, this is like a murder mystery fantasy books. The murder mystery is in the first book, and then the second book is like filling in some background and also having more action in it too. And I quite enjoyed them. They're not my favorites, but I quite enjoyed them. Next, we have a book that's just so sad to see it so low, and that is Overdraft: The Orion Offensive by John Jackson Miller, one of my favorite authors of all time. I love John Jackson Miller. I love his Star Wars books. I love his Star Trek books. He almost exclusively writes media tie-in fiction. However, he wrote exactly one original science fiction novel, and that is this book. And it was basically self-published. This came out in like 2013, and it's not in print anymore, so you cannot get print copies of this book. But this is a science fiction book where this company sends people out trying to do business out in space, and basically there's this tech guy, or this accountant, who basically accidentally bankrupts the company, and so they basically send him on the mission and make him join the group going out to sell things to these aliens. And it's a fun, pulpy science fiction book, and I actually think it's one of his weaker books. I think every book by John Jackson Miller is entertaining, and some of them are my favorite books of all time. However, this book, I understand that it's going to be one of his weaker books, and it was the one of the weakest science fiction books on this list. So I understand why it's rated so low. You cannot get a copy. You might be able to get an ebook on like Kindle, but you can't get physical copies new anymore, sadly. I wish he would put it back in print. I wish he would do sequels and more books in the series, but I doubt that's ever going to happen, especially if they keep offering him new books from franchises. My number 2 has a 3.43 average. Whew, that's bad on Goodreads. And that is the novel Kill the Farm Boy by Delilah S. Dawson and Kevin Hearn. And you know what? Goodreads rated it too high. I did not like this book. This is supposed to be a satirical fantasy, satirizing a lot of fantasy tropes. Instead, it feels like an anti-fantasy book, where you're following what's supposed to be fantasy characters, but it's basically crapping all over the fantasy genre, fantasy ideas. And it's supposed to be satirical and funny, and there are a few funny bits, but most of the book is just feels like it's insulting the readership in some ways, and the authorship of fantasy authors. And so it's supposed to be this great Terry Pratchett-esque or Douglas Adams-esque humorous fantasy book, and it's the start of a trilogy. But I read it, and I love Delilah Dawson, who is one of my favorite authors. She wrote some good Star Wars novels. She wrote good YA books. She wrote a good horror novel. Like, Delilah Dawson is a solid writer for me. But this book, I didn't like at all. I did not like this book at all. And so Goodreads is correct. And so that's my number 2. Now, number 1, I'm so happy about this one because this is probably one of the worst books I've ever read. And it's the lowest on Goodreads, too. And I'm like, I was right. I was right. And that is Shadow Moon by George Lucas and Chris Claremont. And I don't like crapping all over books. I don't like yucking on some people's yums. So if you loved any of these books, then, and I didn't like the book, you know, I bear you no ill will. And if you liked it, good for you. I just have to take a second and say, I did not like this book. I do not use the word hate. I do not use the word hate in my reviews, but I did not like this book. And it's supposed to be a sequel to Willow. And this is the most ridiculously... The decision-making around the making of this book is wild. And I cannot believe that it got put to paper because I think it was just wrong in every direction. Chris Claremont should have just written an original novel, original trilogy, or George Lucas should have just written an original series if he wanted this to be just an original fantasy series. If he wanted it to be a sequel to Willow, he should have just made it a sequel to Willow. And I am not a fan of this book. And this has a 3.27 on Goodreads, and that is too high. That is too high a rating. Goodreads was too nice to this book because it deserves way lower. Awful, awful book. I'm sorry to Chris Claremont and George Lucas that I have to be so mean to you on this. I really am usually a very respectful person on BookTube. I'm trying to be positive. I try to be nice. I try to be, find the good in the books that I read. But this is an unabashed, I don't have positive things to say about this book. So, those are the worst books according to Goodreads. As you can tell, some of the books on here I loved. And I'm like, Goodreads, you're crazy. Why are you rating it so low? And then there were some books that I'm like, yeah, that fits. That makes sense that it's so low. And then there's some books like Shadow Moon that I'm like, that's one of the worst books I've ever read. Why'd you rate it so high, Goodreads? So, if you've read any of these books, let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. Do you agree with me? These are the worst books you've read? Or do you not agree with me? Do you disagree? Let me know all those thoughts in the comments section down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.